Newsroom. We begin with the good news. Europe's no longer in denial. The president of the European Commission says on Wednesday he'll announce measures to bolster banks, part of what José Manuel Barroso sees as a, quote, comprehensive response to the Eurozone's debt crisis. Now, to help concentrate the minds, the last 48 hours have borne witness to the first breakup of a major bank since that sovereign debt crisis blew up over a year ago. It's also seen the umpteenth trip of creditors to Greece, and word that next week's EU summit would be pushed back to the weekend to buy time for meaningful long-term suggestions. Now, the question is, what suggestions? Granting more power to Brussels, perhaps? Already the EU is having a hard time approving the enhanced rescue fund it shook on back in July. Just take a look at Slovakia's parliament, which is debating the matter. Today, in the France 24 debate, how do you recapitalize Europe? And with us to talk about it, the former French Minister for European Affairs, Noël Lenoir. Thank you for joining us. From Brussels, from Germany's ruling CDU party, he's a member of the European Parliament, Andreas Schwab. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Robin Baker, the president of the Paris chapter of the UK's ruling Conservative Party, and fresh off the train from Geneva, where he teaches at the Swiss Finance Institute, Harold Howe. How are you?
Thank you.
By the way, you can always weigh in on the conversation if you want on the France 24 debate Facebook page or on Twitter, where our handle is @FrancoisF24. Let's begin in Brussels. Andreas Schwab, we've been promised game-changing announcements before. In your view, what are we expect from the European Commission on Wednesday?
I mean, the president of the European Commission made quite clear that he wants to win back in a certain way action and power from the heads of government and state that have taken over in a certain way in the last month. And I think that's necessary because what we see these days is in fact that intergovernmental work was very helpful at the beginning of the crisis, but the longer the crisis takes, the more we see that in fact it's not possible anymore to deal with 17 member states of the Eurozone or 27 different heads of states in the European Union. The intergovernmental method is the much better way, and I think Barroso is right, claiming more power back.
Claiming more power back to do what exactly?
To boost the European economy by helping the internal market to grow again. And that can only be done by rules that are applied all over Europe. And secondly, to run that European stability mechanism that should come in place in a few months. And I think that's the way to recapitalize also Europe at international level.
Harold Howe, do you see this as being enough to reassure markets, which, as we know, have been jittery over the past weeks?
I mean, I'm not sure what will come out of Brussels. I'm sure that nothing good will come out of Barroso. He has been the most confused politician all along during this crisis, so I wouldn't put much trust in the Commission coming up with a good plan.
Marine Noël Lenoir, let me ask you your thoughts. He says he's going to talk about recapitalization of banks, something that wasn't even on the table a couple of weeks ago. How much power does the President of the Commission have to move things?
Well, the Commission, as you know, according to the treaty, and as was very rightly said by André Schwab just right now, has the monopoly of initiative. And as you know, they put on the table Basel III, CRD4 text and the text on hedge funds and also EMIR, that is to say the new organization of the market infrastructure. So the Commission, if it is really a power of initiative, allows the member states to avoid diverging and having different opinions.
And do you agree with Harold that perhaps
it is a secret?
The President of the European Commission has been too silent?
Yes, I think so.
Well, he's been marching in the wrong direction all along. I mean, we need a change in strategy. We need a completely different agenda for getting us out of this crisis. And the European community, unfortunately, was instrumental in moving us in the wrong direction. So there's not much to be hoped there, I think, in my mind.
But you were saying when you were on this set just a little while ago that recapitalization of the banks is where it's at, and that's what he's saying now.
Well, I think it's the question and the detail here. How will this happen? In principle, for that, we don't need a European agenda. I mean, every country can recapitalize its bank by its own. as is the suggestion of the German position. So I think moving in the right direction, a lot can be done without European coordination. It's not in principle a coordination problem. It's more a matter of what to do and do the right measures.
Okay. After France's prime minister, by the way, went to Brussels over the weekend, the week began with word that Dexia was being broken up into 3 bits, one in Belgium, one in France, one in Luxembourg, with its Luxembourg arm, by the way, sold off to Qatari investors. While in a Financial Times interview on Monday, the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, urged Eurozone leaders to take a, quote, big bazooka approach to the crisis. Let me ask you, first of all, Andreas Schwab, your thoughts on Cameron's advice there. A big bazooka approach, are you for that?
I think he is absolutely right. We have to take decisions, bold and broad decisions now that can be implemented quickly. But I mean, that's the problem in a certain way of that intergovernmental approach. If you want to unite 27 or 17 member states of the Eurozone from one day to another, it will not work. You have to convince one by one, and that takes time. And therefore, we have to adjourn the council meeting for some days. And that means that we have to convince colleagues and heads of state from other member states to follow what Merkel and Sarkozy apparently have decided on last weekend, and that takes time. And I think that's the proof that this strategy that has helped from the beginning, I think we have to admit that, but that strategy has to come to an end so that we can allow for quicker decisions which are done on the European level.
Robin Baker, the commentators here in France thought it was cheeky of David Cameron to say, come on, shake things up when he himself is the head of a government of a nation that's not in the Eurozone.
I wouldn't agree with that. I think, in fact, I support what Cameron said, but I would only say it's very much a statement of the obvious. And George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, said something very, very similar yesterday. The problem, as has already been made clear, is that the Prime Minister is right to say that. It's a very easy thing to say, but, as has already been mentioned, getting agreement from 17 different Eurozone countries is a formidable task. We don't even know yet what is going to be the result of the debate in the Slovakian parliament.
Noël Lenard, let's roll back the calendar to when you were the European Affairs Minister. It was, 2002 to 2004?
Yeah, that was gross, and the reign of subprimes and banks were very, very profitable.
Did you
in
mind
trading rather than in banking, as you know, not doing their core job. And it was another time, and I think that now we suffer of these practices and the result of these practices, and especially the British. I think that here we have the true example of what is Europe. I think that the German and the French, even though they have not always the same ideas of the way to recapitalize banks at the present time, they differ from the British because they think that the key of the European building is to be an integrated, politically entity and not only a free market. And that's why, as we see nowadays, the intergovernmental method, which is similar to a method at the UN, when you have member states which have different views, have to negotiate all the time, days after days, and you have veto rights. This is not good. We need a political trend, and the result, I think, of the isolation of the attitude of the British in that respect is that the Eurozone is going to replace what should have been the European Union as a whole. And I think that the Eurozone will become a political entity.
So what you're saying is that there'll be more power in Frankfurt, not in Brussels.
Well, I don't mind. Frankfurt, Brussels, Paris, this is the Eurozone. So I'm not looking at the towns or the countries. I'm looking at the formidable power of the euro. And we have to think of the reason of the need of European banks to be recapitalized. It's because they need dollars, because the dollar is still a heaven value, and also it is money which is used in most of the commercial deals, and they need dollar, and American banks don't want to give them dollars, and that's the cause of the crisis today. So my view is that if the euro becomes an international currency as well as the dollar, our problems will be drastically reduced. And that's the aim at the present time, even though it's very difficult, I agree, to have the agreement of the opinion to participate, public opinion and taxpayers to participate to the rescue, to the bailout of banks.
We're going to talk about that public opinion a little bit later on because that's a key issue. But Harold, what is the street cred right now of the euro?
The fundamental problem is not a conflict between Germany and France. I mean, pretending this is sort of just throwing fork into the debate. The real question is who's going to pay for the insolvency and the debt of Greece. Greece won't. Greece is insolvent. They won't pay for it. So there are two possibilities. Either this gets all socialized and it falls upon the taxpayer, or it is concentrated in the current investors, in the investment community, including banks. That is the real question. And the bazooka, what does the bazooka mean? Does it mean the bazooka is shot on the taxpayer, that everything falls on the taxpayer? Or does it mean that we actually recapitalize banks and it falls on the investors? This is the real question. This word bazooka means absolutely nothing. No? And my great fear is if we fire the bazooka on the taxpayer, we will drag the entire Eurozone down into a crisis, because historically, debt crisis and banking crisis that states have tried to solve often then fell into or led to consecutive default. So I think even the credit rating of Germany and France is in danger. So if we span these wide-ranging screens of rescue, this is a real risk. And I think the public, particularly in Germany, and senses is very real.
So what are you saying in effect that the Eurozone should do like was done in Sweden once upon a time, where they take shares in the banks, the states take shares in them?
We have to make sure that the political sector is not taken hostage by the investor community. And the pressure that comes from America and from Britain in that sense is very, very damaging, because they have, their interest of America is to bail out all the pension funds, all the big investors that have hundreds of billions at stake here. So that's the real conflict of interest, not between Germany and France. It's who is going to pay for this? That's the real question.
I fully agree.
So who is going to pay for it?
And yeah, I mean, that's going to be decided. And so far, unfortunately, all these bailout plans that come up so far, they have put all the burden on the taxpayer. Socialize everything. They have formally agreed to a 20% burden sharing, private bailout, private bail-in. But if you look at the details, this was a real farce. There's no private burden sharing so far. So we need a really 150, 180 degree change on this. We have to really bail in the private sector. We have to recapitalize banks, but in a way not like it was done in Germany and France during the crisis, but how it was done in Britain, by nationalizing the banks, by having the tax holder buy shares in these banks. That's real capitalization. That's what we need.
All right, and just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, we can look at how deep that sea of red ink is these days. We can show you a chart showing the billions in euros owned by some of Europe's biggest banks. There you see it. And among them, these are billions that are spelled out in treasury bonds from Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Ireland. Now, over the weekend, the French president traveled to Berlin. Here's what his host had to say.
We are determined to do what is necessary to ensure the recapitalization of Europe's banks. A solid supply of credit is the basis for good economic growth.
Recapitalize the banks. However, this Tuesday, one of the bosses at Crédit Agricole, one of the banks you saw in that chart that's sitting on a lot of Greek and Irish debt. One of the bosses there insists Dexia's collapse has nothing to do with the situation of French banks, rejecting any need for recapitalization. Let me ask you on this question, Andreas Schwab. Voters are complaining that they get the sense that it's the bankers that have been writing the rules up to now. What do you answer to that?
I wouldn't say that, but I would like to come back on what has been discussed so far. I think we need a twofold strategy. We cannot just say we have to pass on the bill to the banks. It's true that taxpayers won't pay for that again, and we have to make sure that investors take their share into the saving of Greece. That's for sure. But on the other side, and that's the second part of the strategy we need these investors in the long run as well. And therefore we have to find an agreement, maybe not an agreement with the investors directly, but within Europe, how we change the Greek debt in a way that is acceptable to those that we need in future to reinvest in Europe again. And therefore very clearly said, I can't imagine that the second step now on Greece will be paid again by the taxpayer, but nonetheless we have to make sure that these international investors, but also European banks, can survive and can find a new strategy in Europe and also in Greece, because we will need them in future as well.
Andreas Schwab, are you in favor of taking shares in banks that need to be recapitalized for the German state, for instance, to do that?
I mean, I think at the moment that's not at stake, because the German banks so far are doing quite well. But if necessary, for sure, we will not pass on again the bill to the taxpayer only. It's clear that we have to make sure that this banking system in Europe will remain stable, even though we have to find a solution for Greece in the next weeks.
Robin Baker?
And for that,
go ahead.
Conclusion, exactly for that, we have also to take the idea to get shares in these banks if necessary.
Robin Baker, when you look at what the British state did, most notably with Northern Rock, the failing banking institution there, are you pleased with the results?
It's difficult to say one is pleased with the results. I think it's the best that could have been made of a bad job. And I very much agree with what has been said. You cannot put the burden on the taxpayer. The burden has to be borne by the banks, and sadly, therefore, to a considerable extent, by the shareholders of the banks, because it was the banks that took the decision to lend the money. And any lender has a responsibility to ensure the soundness of the company or the country to whom it is lending money.
And do you think politicians on the continent are too soft on their banks?
The bazooka should be fired at the shareholders of the banks. That's what you're saying.
To some extent, and if necessary, yes, as everyone around here is saying, by buying shares of the banks. But there has been a move from the Commission, actually, and supported by the Parliament, that I have found rather encouraging. This failure of Greece arose partly because the banks didn't look hard enough at the structure of the Greek debt before lending them the money, but secondly, because it was difficult for them to do so. There was a considerable lack of transparency. And the move that has recently been taken in Brussels, I'm delighted to see, is pushing to increase transparency throughout this system. And if we're talking about what the Commission can do, that is one thing the Commission and the Parliament together have done, and it is something that I very strongly welcome.
And how far Europe should go with reform is what we'll be talking about in part 2. Stay with us. This is the France 24 debate.